In the dead of a quiet night, when no one was paying attention, a solitary man paused before a whiteboard covered in code. In a few seconds, he corrected an error that a team of specialists had struggled with for weeks, unaware that someone was watching him. It was then that the machinery of power, jealousy, and secrets began to turn, and nothing could stop it. Chapter 1. The November rain drummed monotonously on the brick streets of Boston's historic North End as Robert Smith stood before the gate of the Mount Auburn Cemetery, holding a bouquet of white roses whose petals were already darkening with moisture. Beside him, clinging to his leg, stood 8-year-old Susan, a girl with large blue eyes and bright hair braided into pigtails that his neighbor, Mrs. Helen, made for her every morning. "Daddy, can Mom see us?" Susan asked softly, her small breath making white clouds in the cool air. Robert knelt beside the grave of his wife, Jennifer, whose granite headstone glistened with rain. Engraved on the black stone were the words, "Jennifer Smith, 1978-2021, beloved wife and mother. May the angels watch over you." Below the inscription was a photograph, the smiling face of a young woman with delicate features. "Sweetheart, Mom is always watching us," he replied, arranging the roses by the headstone. "She's watching from heaven, and she's proud of the wonderful girl you are." Susan touched the stone with her small hand. "Remember how Mom used to sing me to sleep? That song about the little sunshine hiding behind the clouds?" Robert felt tears sting his eyes. 3 years had passed since Jennifer's death, and the wound was still fresh. He was once a respected engineer at the Pittsburgh steel mill, designing ventilation and hydraulic systems used throughout the entire Midwest. His designs were precise, innovative, respected by his colleagues in the industry. Now he worked as a maintenance man in a luxurious office building downtown, tidying up the offices of those who were once his equals, but he didn't regret the decision. Every dollar he earned went towards Susan's education, for books, notebooks, outfits for school plays, the class trip to Aspen, for a future that was supposed to be better than his present. "Come on, honey," he said, rising from his knees. "Grandma Helen is waiting with dinner. She promised to make your favorite cheese dumplings." As they walked home through the narrow cobbled streets of the North End, passing brownstones with colorful facades and brightly lit shop windows, Robert didn't know that his life would change forever the next day. In the office building, he had been cleaning every night for the past 3 years. A situation awaited him that would shatter everything. He thought about himself, his worth, and his future. Their apartment in South Boston was modest. 2 rooms in a pre-war building, with high ceilings and large windows opening onto a courtyard full of maples. Susan had her corner with a small desk where she did her homework and a shelf full of books, mostly fairy tales, but also her first novels for young readers. Robert used to joke that his daughter read more than half of his former engineering colleagues. "Daddy, what are we going to do tomorrow?" Susan asked, helping him set the table for dinner. "Tomorrow is Sunday, so we'll go to Mass at Old North Church, and then maybe a walk through the Boston Common. I heard that despite the late fall, the chrysanthemums are still blooming. Or maybe we can go to the bookstore on Beacon Street. That lady always has new books for kids." Robert smiled. "We'll see, sweetheart. But remember, you have a math quiz next week." "I'm already studying. Look." Susan ran to her desk and brought over a notebook full of equations. "Ms. Jones said I'm the best in the class at counting." Robert looked over her homework, noticing his daughter's precision and logical thinking. Deep down, he held on to the hope that Susan had inherited from him not only a love for math, but also the technical mind that might one day allow her to achieve more than he ever could. The next evening, when the Liberty Tech office building was deserted, Robert, as usual, started work on the top 10th floor. The building was one of the most modern in Boston. Glass and steel, cutting-edge climate control systems, elevators with electronic panels. Liberty Tech was founded by David Johnson, a former labor union activist who transitioned into IT after the Cold War ended. The CEO's office always required special attention: mahogany desk, leather armchairs, shelves full of books on management and American history. Mary Brown, the 31-year-old vice president, often stayed late, analyzing reports and preparing presentations. Robert knew her by sight, always elegant, always focused, always issuing orders with that special authority of people born into affluence. But that evening, the building seemed completely empty. When Robert walked into the main conference room, his attention was immediately drawn to a huge white board covered with complex mathematical formulas and diagrams. He recognized them immediately. They were calculations concerning the cooling and ventilation systems, but something in those equations was fundamentally wrong. For 7 years as an engineer at the Pittsburgh steel mill, he had designed similar systems. His trained eye, accustomed to catching the slightest errors, immediately noticed the irregularities that could cost the company not only millions of dollars, but also the safety of the entire installation. Without thinking, he approached the board, picked up a marker, and began to correct the calculations. His hand moved surely, changing coefficients, adding missing elements to the equations, marking places where the wrong formulas had been used. "What are you doing?" The voice behind his back was cold, commanding, full of controlled anger. Robert quickly turned around and saw Mary Brown standing in the doorway of the conference room. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back in a bun, her black suit emphasized her slender figure, and fury burned in her eyes. She looked like a judge ready to pass sentence. "I apologize, Ms. Brown," Robert started, moving away from the board. "How dare you touch these calculations? Who gave you the right to interfere with company documents?" Her voice was sharp as a razor, but when she looked at the board, her expression began to change. Mary had graduated with a degree in management from the London School of Economics, but she knew enough engineering basics to recognize that the corrections were not only valid, but also brilliantly simple. "Ma'am, I shouldn't have, but this formula," Robert pointed to the original calculations. "That equation is incorrect. The heat transfer coefficient for this type of material is totally different. If you build the system based on these calculations, there could be an installation overheating and a catastrophic failure that would cost $20, maybe $30 million. Mary stepped closer, studying the changes. Her anger slowly gave way to astonishment, bordering on disbelief. This man in the blue maintenance uniform, whom she had passed in the hallways for 3 years without noticing, had solved a problem in a few minutes that her team of the most qualified engineers had been working on for 2 weeks. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her tone changing from commanding to full of curiosity. "Robert Smith, maintenance man," he answered simply, straightening his shoulders slightly. "No." Mary shook her head. "Who are you really? An ordinary maintenance man doesn't know calculations like these." Robert hesitated. For 3 years he had carefully hidden his past. He was invisible, safe in his anonymity, protected from questions and looks full of pity or contempt. "I was an engineer once," he finally said, his voice barely audible, "but that was a long time ago." Mary stared at him intently, as if trying to read the whole story of his life on his face. Something appeared in her eyes that she couldn't name, maybe respect, maybe curiosity, or maybe something much deeper. "Please stay after work," she said in a tone that brooked no argument, but there was also a hint of politeness in her voice. "I'd like to speak with you longer." When Robert returned home at 1:30 in the morning, Susan had long been asleep. He sat by her bed, gently stroking her bright hair, which lay spread out on the pillow like golden silk. What had possessed him? For years he had tried to be invisible, to live in the shadows, not to draw attention to himself. And now, with one gesture, he had exposed himself to the dangerous light of the spotlight. "God, what did I do?" he whispered to himself, looking at the calm face of his sleeping daughter. The next evening, when all the employees had left the office and the hallways were deserted, Mary waited for Robert in her office. She had taken off her blazer. Her white blouse was slightly wrinkled after the long workday. Without the formal suit, she looked younger, more approachable, and the anger of yesterday was gone from her eyes. "Please sit down," she motioned to the leather armchair across from her desk. "I prefer to stand," Robert replied, feeling uncomfortable in the luxurious setting. That wasn't a request. Her tone was firm, but without the previous aggression. He sat down tentatively on the edge of the chair, as if ready to flee at any moment. "My team checked your corrections," Mary began, leaning against the desk. "All of them were correct. More than that, they were brilliantly simple and effective. You saved the company from financial catastrophe and probably lawsuits." "It was nothing extraordinary," Robert started. "Maybe not for you, it was for us," she interrupted. "Why did you do it? Why did you risk your job to help a company that employs you only as a maintenance man?" Robert shrugged in the gesture that had become his trademark. "I couldn't stand by and watch a mistake that could hurt people." "Where did you go to school?" "Carnegie Mellon University, Mechanical and Energy Engineering Department. I graduated with honors in 2008. "Did you work in the industry?" 7 years. At the Pittsburgh Steel Mill as a ventilation and climate control system designer, then 3 years at Ironworks Inc. as chief engineer. "And why are you working as a maintenance man now?" The question hung in the air like a knife blade. Robert was silent for a long time, fighting his own demons, the pain he couldn't express in words. "Because sometimes life turns out differently than we plan," he finally replied, his voice full of resignation and unarticulated tragedy. Mary stood up and walked to the tall window overlooking the downtown. Outside the pane, the Cathedral of St. Joseph was visible, illuminated by the evening lights. Boston at night was like a painting, beautiful, nostalgic, full of history. "I want to offer you a job," she said, not turning away from the window. "A technical consultant position, a permanent contract, a decent salary, a chance to return to your profession." "No." "Excuse me?" She turned around quickly, surprised by the unequivocal refusal. "I said no." Robert rose from the chair, straightening his shoulders. "Thank you for the offer, but I have my work, and it suits me." Mary looked at him with a mixture of irritation and fascination. "You're the most talented man I've met in years, and you're turning down a chance to return to the profession you loved enough to dedicate the best years of your life to." "Yes, I am." "Why, for heaven's sake?" Frustration resonated in her voice. Robert stopped at the door, his hand already on the knob. For a long moment, he stood with his back turned, as if gathering the strength to utter the words he had avoided for months. "Because not everyone can afford the luxury of dreams, Ms. Brown," he said softly, and then walked out, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Mary was left alone in her office, her heart beating strangely fast. In 15 minutes, this man had shattered everything she thought about social classes, intelligence, pride, and humility. For the first time in years, someone had refused her, and what intrigued her even more was that he had done it with dignity, not out of fear or resignation. She sat down at her desk and stared at the corrected calculations on the board for a long time, thinking about the man who could solve a technical problem in a few minutes, but apparently couldn't solve the problems of his own life. Who was Robert Smith really? What had happened in his life that a brilliant engineer was hiding his talent behind a maintenance uniform? And why did his refusal make her feel insecure in her role as vice president of the company for the first time in years? Chapter 2. For the next week, Mary tried to forget about Robert, but it proved impossible. Every technical problem she struggled with reminded her of how naturally and surely he solved complex issues. Her team, made up of graduates from the best technical universities in the Northeast, could not match the intuition of the man who cleaned their offices after hours. On Thursday, during the weekly board meeting in the luxurious conference room on the 10th floor, CEO David Johnson, a graying man in his 60s whose hands still remembered work at the lathes in the Seattle shipyard, asked a question that threw her into confusion. "Mary, I heard from Michael that someone finally helped you solve the problem with the project for the Chicago factory. Our team worked on it for 2 fruitless weeks. Who was it?" Mary felt all eyes turn to her. Silence fell in the conference room, where reports and company development plans lay on the mahogany table. "One of the outside consultants," she lied smoothly, trying for an indifferent tone. "What are his credentials? I'd like to speak with him personally. If he truly solved a problem that our best engineers couldn't manage, maybe we should consider a permanent collaboration." "It was a one-time consultation," Mary replied quickly, praying inwardly that the CEO wouldn't press the issue. The specialist was very busy. Fortunately, the meeting moved on to other topics. They discussed company expansion plans, new government contracts, possibilities for international market growth. But Mary knew that the truth would come out sooner or later. David Johnson hadn't achieved his position by accident. He had a talent for extracting the truth from the most convoluted situations. That same evening, when the building was almost empty, she decided to talk to Robert again. She found him in the 8th floor restroom, where he was methodically cleaning the mirrors. In the fluorescent neon light, he looked tired, older than his 34 years. His movements were mechanical, automatic, as if he had performed this task thousands of times. "So you need to talk," she said without preamble, standing in the doorway. "At work?" he asked, not stopping his mirror cleaning. "Doesn't the vice president have more important things to do?" "Yes, at work. And it is precisely about those important things that I want to talk, about your future at this company." Robert stopped and looked at her in the mirror. Their eyes met in the reflection, and a tension hung between them that neither could name. "I've already said everything I had to say," he replied, returning to his work. "But I haven't," she said firmly, walking into the small room. "I'm the vice president of this company, and I won't allow talent to be wasted because of what exactly? Pride, fear, a false sense of humility. Talent?" Robert turned to her abruptly, fury flashing in his eyes. "Ma'am, I am not one of your charity projects. I am not another problem to be solved, or a toy for a board vice president looking for entertainment." His words hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, she stood in silence, trying to gather her thoughts and calm her rapidly beating heart. "Do you think it was easy for me to come here?" she finally said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That this is some whim of a privileged rich kid? I haven't slept a wink for the last 2 nights thinking about what you said, about how not everyone can afford the luxury of dreams." Robert turned off the water and leaned against the sink, his shoulders drooping with resignation. "And what did you conclude from that?" he asked more quietly, as if he suddenly felt tired of the whole situation. "That you are right, but also that I have no idea what that truly means," she admitted honestly, and a hint of humility he hadn't heard before appeared in her voice. "My whole life, everything has been handed to me on a silver platter. The best private schools, study in London, the vice president position in the company my father built. I never had to choose between dreams and survival." "Then why are you doing this?" he asked, looking her straight in the eye. "Why do you care so much about helping me?" Mary pondered for a long moment. No one had ever asked her this question directly, and the answer that came to her mind surprised her. "Because for the first time in my life, I've met someone who doesn't want anything from me," she replied slowly. "Everyone around me is either afraid of me or wants something from me. They're either counting on a promotion, a loan, or some protection. And you just did what you thought was right, without any hidden motives, with nothing in return." Robert watched her attentively, and his expression slowly changed. For the first time, he saw in her eyes not arrogance or haughtiness, but sincerity and something that might have been loneliness. "Ma'am," he said in a gentler tone, "I genuinely cannot afford experiments. I have a daughter who is counting on a roof over her head and food on the table tomorrow, that she can go to school, have books, clothes. My current job gives me that security. But have you never thought that Susan could be proud of a father who utilizes his talent?" she asked cautiously. "Of a father who shows her that it's possible to strive for something more?" Robert clenched his jaw. She had hit the most sensitive point of his existence. "You know what?" he said, his voice breaking. "Susan is already proud of me. Every evening when I come home, she asks me about my day at work. I tell her about the people I met, the problems I solved, how a clean and tidy office helps everyone work better, and she listens with such curiosity and tells me that I'm her biggest hero." His voice broke on the last word, and Mary felt her heart jump into her throat. "That doesn't mean you can't be her hero in another way too," she said gently. "You can be a hero in many ways." "But it means I don't have to," he replied firmly, straightening his shoulders. "Ma'am, please let me do my job in peace. I don't want complications. I don't need a revolution in my life." Mary nodded and left without a word, but in her heart remained not only regret for the rejection, but also admiration for the man who put his child's well-being above his own ambition. The next day was Saturday. Mary, instead of spending the weekend golfing with clients at an exclusive club in Boston, as she usually did, decided to walk around the North End. She couldn't explain why, but she found herself on the common, watching families stroll among the stalls, listening to the chime ringing every hour from the cathedral tower. At one of the tables at the coffee shop, the Lighthouse, right below the tower, she saw a familiar profile. Robert was sitting with a small girl with bright hair braided into pigtails, telling her something with animation, pointing to the Gothic peaks of the downtown buildings. The girl, Susan, it must be her, was laughing loudly and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Mary hid behind one of the columns, secretly watching them. Robert, in the autumn sun, without his uniform, in simple jeans and a grey shirt, looked completely different. He resembled a college professor more than a maintenance man. When he leaned in to show his daughter something in a guidebook, Mary noticed a tenderness and patience in his face that she hadn't seen before. "Daddy, why does the Thanksgiving Gratitude Circle happen every year?" Susan asked, pointing to an illustration in the guide. "It's a very old tradition, sweetheart. Long, long ago, people had a tough time, and the tradition is a symbol of victory over hardship, but also a reminder that sometimes we have to be brave, even when it seems very hard. Like you, Daddy. Are you brave too?" Robert smiled sadly. "I try to be brave for you, Susan." Suddenly the girl pointed toward Mary. "Daddy, look, that lady is staring at us." Robert turned his head and their eyes met. For a moment they sat there, looking at each other through the crowd of tourists, market vendors, and the seagulls circling the area. Mary felt like a child caught doing something forbidden. She quickly turned away and left, feeling embarrassed by her own behavior. But she didn't know that Robert kept looking in her direction for a long time, wondering what she was doing there alone on a Saturday afternoon, why she looked so sad and lost. "Daddy? Who was that?" Susan asked, watching the departing woman. "A co-worker," he replied vaguely. "She looked very sad," the girl stated with that peculiar insight of children who can see things that adults miss. "By her eyes. Mom always said that eyes can't lie." Robert looked at his daughter with surprise. "How do you know that?" "Because Mom told me that when someone is really sad, you can see it in their eyes even when they smile. That lady wasn't smiling, but she was sad in her eyes." That evening, Robert couldn't fall asleep for a long time. He lay in his bed in the small South Boston apartment, listening to the sounds of the city, streetcars crossing the bridge, the laughter of young people returning from weekend parties, the church bells ringing midnight. He thought about Mary's gaze, the loneliness he had seen in her posture. For the first time he began to wonder if their situations were more similar than he had initially thought. On Monday, their behavior toward each other changed in a subtle but noticeable way. When they passed each other in the corridors, they greeted each other with polite distance, but without the previous tension. Mary didn't press him about the job anymore, and Robert allowed himself short conversations when she came to clean his office around 10 in the evening. "How's Susan doing?" she asked one evening, seeing a smile on his face as he checked a text message on his phone. "She got an A in science," he answered proudly. "She did a presentation on Boston's birds. Apparently she was the best in the class." "Who does she get that talent for learning from?" Robert hesitated. "Jennifer, my wife, was a teacher, math and physics. She always said that the most important thing in learning is curiosity about the world." "And Susan inherited that curiosity?" "Sometimes she has so many questions that I can't answer them all. Yesterday she asked me why the days are shorter in winter, and then she wanted to know how the heating works in our apartment." Mary smiled. "And did you answer her?" "Of course. I showed her how the radiators work, explained what heat circulation is. She was delighted. It's beautiful that you can share your knowledge with her. It's the only thing I can give her, knowledge and love. I can't afford expensive toys or vacations, but I can teach her to understand the world." The real breakthrough came on Wednesday, when the company's computer system broke down. All the technicians from the outsourcing company had been sitting over the problem since morning, but to no avail. The servers had stopped functioning. The accounting system crashed, and clients were starting to call with inquiries about delayed reports. At 9 in the evening, when the building was almost empty, Mary found Robert in the server room in the basement of the building. He stood among the rows of humming computers, watching the blinking lights and listening to the sounds the machines made. "What are you doing here?" she asked, surprised. "I heard about the system problems today," he replied, not taking his eyes off the servers. "I thought maybe I could help. But this isn't your field. For 7 years at the steel mill, I designed not only ventilation systems, but also the computer networks that manage the entire installation," he explained. "This isn't a software problem." "What do you mean?" Robert pointed to one of the server racks. "That block has an irregular blinking rhythm on the diodes. And do you hear that sound? That's not the normal hum of the fans. There's probably a problem with the cooling unit in one of the servers, causing overheating and cascading errors throughout the network." Mary immediately called the head technician of the service company, who arrived an hour later with a full set of diagnostic tools. After 20 minutes of meticulous testing, he confirmed Robert's diagnosis. One of the cooling units in the central server had failed, causing cascade errors throughout the system. "How did you know?" the technician asked with admiration as he replaced the damaged part. "My specialist took an entire day just to locate the problem." "Experience," Robert replied modestly, "or maybe just luck." When they were alone in the server room, Mary sat down on one of the metal boxes standing against the wall. For the first few minutes, silence reigned, broken only by the steady hum of the fans. "No one has been able to surprise me this much in years," she finally said. "It was just a stroke of luck," Robert countered, checking all the lights on the servers one last time. "No," she shook her head firmly. "It was knowledge, experience, and intuition. 3 things that no school can teach. The vice president is too kind." "Mary, please call me Mary when we're alone." Robert paused and looked at her. In the neon light of the server room, she looked different, younger, more human, without the mask of formality she wore during the day. "Mary," he began uncertainly. "Yes? Can I ask you something personal?" She was surprised. "Of course. What really happened in your life? Why is a woman who has everything, a career, money, social standing, spending her evenings alone in the office, trying to help a maintenance man who clearly doesn't want help?" Mary was silent for a long moment, fiddling with a pen she found in her blouse pocket. "It's a complicated story," she finally replied. "I have time." And so, in the underground server room, amidst the hum of computers and the flickering of lights, Mary told him her story. About a childhood spent in boarding schools because her father was building the company and her mother was busy socializing. About studying in London, where she was a brilliant student but had no real friends. About returning to the States and discovering that everyone treated her as the CEO's daughter, not as an independent woman. "I feel like I'm in a gilded cage," she said. "I have everything I could ever dream of, but none of it is truly mine. The company is my father's baby. The apartment was bought with his money, and my friends are mostly business contacts. And your family. Family is an even more complicated matter for us," she smiled bitterly. "My father loves his company more than his own children, My mother moved to France with a partner 20 years younger than her. My brother lives in the south, and we talk maybe 3 times a year. Robert listened in silence, starting to understand why this woman, who seemingly had everything, felt so lonely. Is that why you work so hard? He asked cautiously. To prove to your father that you're worth something? To prove it to myself, she corrected him. That I'm not just a pretty doll with a good last name, that I can create something valuable. You are, Robert began, but stopped. Yes, you are a much stronger person than I initially thought. Mary looked at him surprised. How do you know that? Because I see how you work, how you treat people, even maintenance men, how you care not only about the company's profits, but also about the fate of the employees. That's not faked, but it's also not a happy life, she admitted. Sometimes I think I'm missing all the important things, focusing only on my career and proving to everyone that I'm useful for something. Like what things? Mary pondered. True love, a family, a home where there is warmth, not just sterile order, children who will need me, not just respect me for what I buy them. Robert smiled sadly. I had all that, and sometimes I think I'll never experience it again. Why? Because I'm a different person now than I was when I met Jennifer. I'm tired, wounded, focused only on Susan. What woman would want to tie her life to a widower who works as a maintenance man and has a small child to support? Mary looked at him with something that could have been tenderness. A woman who could see the man behind the uniform, she replied without hesitation. Their eyes met, and for a long moment they sat in silence. Something unspoken hung in the air, a tension that neither of them wanted to name. We should go back, Mary finally said, but she didn't move. Yes, Robert agreed, but he also remained motionless. Robert, she began. Yes? If I offered you a job in a way that wouldn't threaten your life stability, would you at least agree to consider it? Robert thought for long minutes. That would depend on the terms. Consultations, project-based, maybe once a week, maybe less, depending on the need, during hours that don't conflict with your duties as a maintenance man. For an extra salary that would allow you to save for Susan's college education. Why are you doing this? Because, she hesitated, searching for the right words, because for the last few weeks, I've been getting to know the man behind the maintenance man, and I can't understand why someone with such talent has to hide it. Is it only about the talent? He asked, looking her straight in the eye. Mary felt her cheeks flush with shame. No, it's not only about the talent. Robert stood up and walked closer. Mary, I really can't afford complications in my life. I have a daughter I have to raise, and I can't afford mistakes that could hurt her. It doesn't have to be a mistake. What if it is? Mary reached out and gently touched his hand. If it is, we'll deal with it together. Robert looked at her hand resting on his. Since Jennifer's death, no one had touched him like that, with tenderness, with closeness, with trust. All right, he said softly. Let's try. Would their newfound bond survive the coming difficulties? Would Robert find the courage to trust the woman who could bring a new direction to his life? And would Mary be ready for the consequences of the feeling that was growing between them? Chapter 3. As they returned from the server room to the main building, the snow began to fall more heavily, covering the brick streets of the North End with a thin layer of white. On the steps in front of the office entrance, Mary slipped on the icy stone. Robert instinctively supported her, and for a few seconds she remained in his embrace, feeling his warmth, the scent of his skin, a mixture of deodorant and something undefined that was simply him. Thank you, she whispered, not moving away. You're welcome, he replied, but he didn't let go immediately either. They stood so close, looking into each other's eyes in the light of the street lamp and the falling snow. Boston on a winter night was magical. The common glowed with yellow light, smoke rose from the chimneys of the brownstones, and the sounds of the city were muffled by the white blanket. Mary, Robert began, his voice husky. Yes? What are we doing? I don't know, she answered honestly, but I think I like it. And then they kissed, gently, carefully, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile and precious. When they drew apart, they were both breathing faster, and confusion was etched on their faces. This complicates things, Robert stated. All the most important things do, Mary replied, smiling for the first time in weeks, with a natural, happy smile. A week after their first kiss, Mary couldn't focus on work. Their conversation about the past, about dreams and losses, had stirred something deep inside her. For the first time in years, she felt understood, not judged for her background or position. On Thursday evening, when they were alone in the building, Robert came to clean her office later than usual. Mary was working on a proposal for a new contract for the factory in Chicago, but her vision kept blurring. Sorry I'm so late, he said, entering with his cleaning cart. I had to finish the lower floors first. It's fine, she replied, putting down her documents. "How is Susan? How is she handling the preparations for the holidays?" A smile appeared on Robert's face, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in a long time. "Susan is a little perpetual motion machine this time of year. Yesterday, she brought home a list of 10 things she wants to do before Christmas Eve dinner: bake cookies, make tree decorations, write a letter to Santa Claus, and 7 other projects." "Sounds familiar," Mary chuckled. "I made similar lists when I was her age, only no one had time to help me with them." "That's sad." "Maybe a little, but now I understand that parents have their own problems and limitations too." Robert began to wipe down the desk, but his movements were less mechanical than usual. "You know, Susan keeps asking me about you." Mary looked up from her laptop. "About me? What does she ask?" "If you're lonely, why you look sad, if you'd like to come over for Christmas." "And what do you tell her?" "That it's complicated." Robert stopped and looked at her. "But the truth is, I'm wondering about those same questions." Mary put down her pen and stood up from her desk. "Robert, will you tell me more about your projects? About the old days, when you were still an engineer?" And so, under the light of the night lamp in the empty office building, Robert began to tell his story. About the ventilation systems he designed for the new steel plant in Pittsburgh, about the bridges he helped reinforce after the Great Flood in 1997, about the plan to start his own engineering company that he carried in his head for years. "The most interesting was the project for the hospital in Baltimore," he said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We had to design a system that would ensure sterile air in the operating rooms, but at the same time be energy efficient. I spent 3 months researching various solutions until I finally had the idea to combine traditional ventilation with heat recovery." Mary listened, fascinated. "And it worked?" "Better than we expected. The system used 40% less energy than standard solutions, and the air quality was even better. That must have been an incredible feeling, to know that your work could save someone's life." Robert paused for a moment. "Yes, that's the feeling I miss now. The feeling that I'm doing something truly important." "And now? Do you feel that your work is important?" "Cleaning is important too," he replied, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "A clean working environment allows others to function better. But it's not the same as designing life-saving systems." "No," he admitted after a long silence. "It's not the same." Mary stepped closer. "Robert, if I offered you not just occasional consultations, but a serious return to the profession, what would you say?" "That it's impossible." "Why?" "Because my reputation in the industry was ruined. When Jennifer got sick, I often had to take time off to be with her and Susan. The company was understanding at first, but after a year, they started pressuring me. When I finally left to take care of my wife, I was labeled as unreliable. Business is ruthless. A lost reputation is rarely regained. But what if someone gave you a chance to prove you're still the same talented engineer?" Robert looked at her suspiciously. "Mary, what are you talking about?" "About possibilities. About the fact that maybe your story doesn't have to end with cleaning offices. I don't want to be the object of someone's charity." "What if it wasn't charity, but a business necessity?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the desk. "What if our company genuinely needed someone with your qualifications and experience?" Robert listened in silence, hope and skepticism battling in his eyes. "Keep talking. We have a large contract to modernize the ventilation system at the Boston General Hospital. Our current designers don't have experience in this type of specialized installation. We need someone who designed similar systems before." Robert finished for her. "Exactly. And what about my reputation? The fact that I'm a maintenance man without any formal references from the last 3 years?" Mary stood up and walked to the window. Outside the pane, she could see the snow covering the roofs of the North End brownstones. "I've thought about that. We could start with consultations, as we agreed earlier. If your work is good, I could gradually introduce you to larger projects. Not as the maintenance man who suddenly became an engineer, but as a specialist we discovered. That would mean lying. Not lying, just creating a new narrative." Robert thought for a long time, pacing the office. "What about Susan? I still need a steady job that allows me to be with her every evening. Design work can often be done from home, especially the conceptual phase. You could work when Susan is at school and be with her when she returns." "It sounds too good to be true." Mary walked up to him. "Robert, would it be such a mistake to try to reclaim what you lost? What if it doesn't work out? What if it turns out I can no longer design at the level I once did? Then it will mean we took a risk. But is a life without risk even a life at all?" Robert stopped in front of her, looking her straight in the eye. "Why are you doing this? Really? Why?" Mary took a deep breath. Because Because when I talk to you about engineering, about projects, about ideas, I see a passion in your eyes that none of my current employees have. And because, she hesitated, yes, because I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung between them. For the first time, one of them had spoken what they both felt but were afraid to name. Robert stepped closer and held her face in his hands. Mary, I can't promise you an easy relationship. I have a daughter who will always be my priority. I have a past full of pain and loss. I'm a man who has to rebuild his life from scratch. I can't promise an easy relationship either, she replied. I work at my father's company, where my every move is observed. I have the pressure of achievement and expectations that sometimes overwhelm me. But I know one thing. What? That with you, I feel like myself. For the first time in years, I don't have to play a role. They kissed again, this time with more certainty and passion. When they drew apart, they both knew they had crossed a point of no return. It's very late, Mary whispered. Susan must be worried. Susan stayed at Grandma Jennifer's place for the night, Robert replied, for the first time in 3 years. And how do you feel about that? Strange. Like something is missing, but at the same time, like I'm a young man again who can do whatever he wants. Mary smiled. Would that young man like some coffee? The all-night diner near here makes the best coffee in Boston. And would that coffee happen to be an excuse to prolong this evening? Quite possible. In that case, I'd be delighted. The diner, the Anchor, was indeed open all night. At this hour it was almost empty, just a few night owls, a group of students preparing for exams, and an old man reading the newspaper in the corner. Robert and Mary sat at a table by the window, where they could see the illuminated Old North Church and the snow falling on the brick square. Robert, without his uniform, looked completely different. In a simple black shirt and dark pants, he resembled a university professor more than a maintenance man. His posture was straighter, more confident, as if the very prospect of returning to his profession restored his former self-assurance. Will you tell me more about yourself? He asked, sipping his coffee. About what you're like outside of work? Mary was surprised by the question. There's not much to tell. The standard life of a businesswoman. I don't believe it. Everyone has their story. Mary sighed and began to tell her story. About a childhood spent in the shadow of her father's ambitions, about the pressure of being the CEO's daughter, about the loneliness that accompanied her for most of her life. I had a fiancé in London, she said after a long pause. Marcus, he was a British corporate lawyer, very elegant, very suitable for a girl in my social position. What happened? When I decided to return to the States to help my father with the company, he said that if I left London for a country like the States, it meant I wasn't the woman he wanted to spend his life with. That must have been painful. For a while, yes. But after I returned, I realized I never really loved him. She took a sip of her coffee, looking through the window at the snowy street. Marcus was safe, appropriate. Everyone thought it was a perfect match. But now I understand. I chose him with my head, not my heart. And your family? Did they support your decision? Family is a very complicated matter for us. She smiled bitterly. My father was absorbed in building his business empire. When I was 16, my mother decided that life with a businessman bored her and left for France with a younger partner, a Parisian artist who had great manners and no money. You were left alone? With a father who worked 18 hours a day and a brother who fled to college in the West at the first opportunity. Yes, you could say I was left alone. Robert listened in silence, starting to understand why this woman, who had everything on the outside, felt so lonely. Is that why you work so hard? To prove to your father that you're a worthwhile person? To prove it to myself, she corrected him, that I'm not like my mother, that I won't run away at the first sign of difficulty, that I'm more than just a pretty doll with a good last name. You are so much more, Robert said simply, but with such conviction that Mary felt a warmth spreading through her heart. How do you know? Because I see how you behave with people, how you treat every employee, from the cleaning crew to the board members, with basic respect. Because you came down to the server room at 10 in the evening to check if the maintenance man needed help. Because, he hesitated. Because what? Because when we talk about engineering projects, you listen with genuine curiosity, as if you're truly interested, not just trying to be polite. Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes. No one has ever said anything like that to me. Maybe no one has taken the time to truly get to know you before. For a long time they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Robert, Mary finally spoke, what do you think about all this? About us? I think I'm terrified, he answered honestly. For 3 years my life was predictable, safe, simple. Work, Susan, basic duties. And now I feel like I'm waking up from a long sleep, and I'm not sure if I'm ready for the reality that awaits outside. Mary reached across the table and touched his hand. What if that reality is better than the dream? What if it isn't? We'll find out, she replied with a smile. Together, as they walked back through the snowy streets of the North End, their conversation drifted to lighter topics. Holiday plans, favorite books, childhood memories. Robert talked about his first attempts at building model airplanes with Susan. Mary about her attempts at cooking, which usually ended with ordering takeout. I have to confess something, she said when they reached the place where her car was parked. I've never baked a pie in my life. Every time I tried, it ended in burnt food and open windows to air out the smoke. Robert laughed loudly. Maybe I can teach you. Susan and I make dumplings every other Sunday. It's our tradition. Would you accept an amateur into your culinary team? For exceptional participants, we'll make an exception. When they said goodbye, they both knew that something significant had changed between them. It was no longer a relationship based on a chance encounter and mutual intrigue. It was the beginning of something deeper, something truer. But they didn't know that the next day would bring events that would put their new relationship to its first serious test. Chapter 4. James Jones sat in his Spartan office, analyzing the photographs provided by the private detective he had hired a month earlier. The 53-year-old chief financial officer of Liberty Tech, nicknamed Iron Jim by the employees, had survived all the changes in the company over the last 20 years for a reason. His lips curved into a satisfied smile as he looked through the compromising material. Clear photos lay on the desk in front of him, Mary and Robert holding hands in a diner, their kiss in front of the company building, their conversation in front of the server room. The photographer was a professional. Every photo was sharp and unambiguous in its interpretation. James had been looking for a way to get rid of Mary from the company for months. She was too intelligent, too ambitious, and, worst of all, too close to CEO David Johnson, who was increasingly talking about handing over the full leadership of the company to her next year. James had worked 40 years, rising from a simple accountant during the Cold War era through the tumultuous times of economic transition to get where he was. He wasn't going to step aside for some young upstart, even if she was the boss's daughter. Now he had the perfect pretext for action. That same day, when Mary came to work with a smile on her face, the first time in weeks she truly felt happy, a standard note was waiting on her desk. Meeting with CFO Jones, my office, immediately. James's office was the antithesis of all the other rooms in the company. Where modern furniture, bright colors, and glass walls dominated elsewhere, his office was characterized by Spartan austerity. A metal desk from the 80s, gray carpeting, no personal items whatsoever. Only a large American flag on the wall and a photograph of President Reagan hinted at the owner's true beliefs. Mary, please sit down, he said, not looking up from his documents. We need to talk about a very serious matter. I'm listening, she replied, immediately sensing the threat in his tone. James placed the first photo on the desk without a word. Mary felt the blood drain from her face. What is the meaning of this? She asked, trying to remain calm and composed. The vice president of the company is romantically involved with a maintenance man, he listed with cold precision, pulling out more photos. In public places. Kissing in front of the corporate building. This means a scandal that could destroy Liberty Tech's reputation. That's my private life, she began, but he interrupted her with a wave of his hand. Nothing is private when a person holds a high position. His voice was sharp as a razor, especially when class differences are involved, which could be exploited by our competitors, the sensational media, or clients who might doubt the company's professionalism. Mary sat down uninvited, knowing she had to buy time and gather information about her opponent's intentions. What do you want from me? Your resignation. By the end of the week, we'll find some elegant excuse, new career challenges, starting your own business, a job offer abroad. And if I refuse? James smiled coldly, exposing his yellowed teeth. Then these photos will go to the Boston Globe and all our major clients. Along with additional information I've managed to gather about your new acquaintance. He pulled a thick folder from the drawer. Robert Smith, 34 years old, widower, father of an 8-year-old daughter, but also a man who uses false qualifications to participate in company projects and misleads management about his true competencies. Robert never used false qualifications, Mary exploded. No? Then how did an ordinary maintenance man know about the cooling system failure in the server room? How could he solve the technical problem with the Chicago project that a team of qualified engineers couldn't handle? An ordinary cleaner suddenly becomes an expert in complex engineering systems. James leaned across the desk, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. This looks like systematic deception. A man posing as a maintenance man, but in reality infiltrating the company for espionage or financial gain. Very serious accusations. Mary felt the world collapsing beneath her feet. James had planned everything. Every detail was calculated. "Do I have until Friday to make a decision?" she asked, trying to retain the last shreds of her dignity. "Until Friday, the end of the workday," he confirmed. "And Mary," he stopped her as she got up to leave. "Not a word about this conversation to anyone, especially your friend. That would be very ungentlemanly toward him and his daughter." The last words were a clear threat. James made it clear that if she didn't comply, not only would she lose her job and reputation, but Robert could face serious legal problems, and Susan, what would happen to the little girl if her father was accused of fraud? The next few days were torture for Mary. She couldn't concentrate on any work. She avoided Robert whenever possible, and at night she lay awake, tossing and turning, considering her options. She could resign and protect Robert and Susan, but that would mean capitulation to James and the end of her dreams of leading the company, as well as the relationship with the man she had come to love. She could fight, but she risked destroying the lives of the people who had become the most important to her in the world. On Wednesday, when Robert came to clean her office, she couldn't bear the emotional pressure. "We need to talk," she said, barely controlling the tremor in her voice. Robert immediately noticed something was wrong. "Did something happen? You look like you haven't slept in days and you're pale as a ghost." "Robert, if I told you that we have a problem, a very serious problem that could destroy our lives, what would you do?" Robert put down his cleaning rags and approached her desk. "What problem? What are you talking about?" Mary struggled for a long time, but finally told him everything about the photos, James's threats, the ultimatum. With every word, Robert's face hardened, and the resignation she recognized from their first meeting appeared in his eyes. When she finished, Robert sat down heavily in the chair and was silent for a long time. "I knew this would end badly," he finally said quietly, staring at the floor. "Don't say that. Mary, I'm destroying your life." "Exactly what I feared from the beginning." He looked up at her, resignation but also pain in his eyes. "You have a great future ahead of you, and I'm just an obstacle." "You are not an obstacle. It's James." "James wasn't kissing you in front of the building?" he interrupted sharply. "James didn't introduce complications into your life. James wasn't foolish enough to think that a maintenance man and a vice president could be together without consequences." Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes. "So this is it? You're just giving up?" Robert stood up and walked to the window. Down below on the common, traffic was as busy as usual. Tourists were taking photos, and the city's life went on at a normal pace. "This isn't about me," he said, not turning away from the window. "It's about you, your future, your career. I can't let you sacrifice everything for me." "What if that's my decision?" "That means you don't know me at all." He turned to her, determination, but also despair in his voice. "Do you think I could be happy knowing I destroyed the life of the woman that He hesitated. "That you what?" "That I love," he finished in a whisper. Mary ran to him quickly. "Then let's fight together. James is a manipulator and a liar, but he's not invincible. He has his weaknesses." "Mary, face the facts." Robert cupped her face in his hands. "I'm a maintenance man without any formal references for the last 3 years, with a daughter to support, with no money for lawyers, or a long war with the system. You're the vice president of a major company, with a future ahead of you. What are our chances against a man who has power, money, and political connections? Love sometimes conquers everything else." "Love is not a fairy tale, Mary," he said painfully. "Love is daily choices, responsibility, practical decisions. And I can't be responsible for destroying your future. But I want to build that future with you. You can't want something that's impossible." Mary felt her heart breaking into pieces. "So what do you propose?" Robert moved away from her, as if every inch of physical distance helped him maintain emotional distance. "I'm quitting tomorrow. I'll find something else. Maybe in another city. You stay, you fight James on your own terms, and I'll make sure Susan doesn't suffer because of her father's mistakes." "That's not a solution." "It's the only solution that protects you and my daughter," he replied firmly. "Mary, please, let me leave with dignity. Let me be the man who can protect the people he loves." Neither of them slept that night. Mary sat in her luxurious apartment, looking out the window at the Potomac, and wondering if love was indeed stronger than all adversities, or if it was just a romantic myth. Robert lay in bed in the small apartment, listening to the peaceful breathing of a sleeping Susan, and wondering how to explain to an 8-year-old why they had to start all over again. The next day, Robert wrote a resignation letter and left it on the Human Resources desk. When Mary saw it, she felt a fury she had never experienced before. It was no longer just about her own happiness, but about justice, about the fact that people like James could not be allowed to win through intimidation and manipulation. She entered James's office without knocking. "You won," she said. "Excuse me?" James feigned surprise, but triumph flashed in his eyes. "Robert resigned. You have your scandal taken care of. Now leave me alone." That was a wise decision on his part. "And yours, of course." "One thing." Mary leaned her hands on his desk, looking him straight in the eye. "This is not the end. I will find a way to pay you back for all of this." "Threats, Mary? That's not your style." "Not threats. A promise." Her voice was calm, but fire burned in her eyes. "You may win the battle, but you won't win the war." As she left, James felt a pang of unease for the first time. Mary didn't look like a defeated woman. She looked like a woman who had just found a reason to fight. That evening in the empty office building, Mary sat in her office, planning. Robert might have given up, but she wouldn't. Not without a fight for the man she had allowed herself to love, and not without resisting the system that punished people for honesty and integrity. But she didn't know that at the same time, in the small apartment, Susan was begging her father for the truth. "Daddy, why are you packing our things? What happened?" she asked through tears. "We have to move, sweetheart. Daddy found a new job, but I like our school, and Grandma Helen, and that Lady Mary that we won't see anymore." Robert knelt beside his daughter and hugged her tightly. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions that might seem bad, but they serve to protect the ones we love. "But I'm not scared," Susan cried out. "Why do all adults think children are afraid of everything? I'm not scared when you're with me." Her words struck him right in the heart. For years he had protected his daughter from the hardships of life, but maybe he had also protected her from the possibility of participating in something greater than ordinary existence. Can love survive when all possible obstacles seem to be arrayed against it? Will Mary find a way to defeat James and save not only Robert, but also their relationship? And what will happen when the truth about Robert's past comes out at the worst possible moment? Chapter 5. Robert was already on his third day of intensive job hunting. Boston, although dynamically developing since the early 90s, was not kind to 34-year-old widowers who had worked far below their qualifications for the last few years. His last place of employment, a maintenance man at a prestigious tech company, did not provide a very impressive reference for potential employers looking for engineers. However, much worse than the prospect of professional difficulties was what was happening at home. Susan, even though she was only an 8-year-old girl, perfectly sensed her father's tension and sadness. She asked about the reasons for packing, why they were preparing for another move, why Miss Mary no longer visited. In the evening, when he returned from another fruitless job interview, he found his daughter sitting at the kitchen table with pieces of paper scattered around her. On one of them, Susan was drawing a small house with a red roof, a garden full of flowers, and 3 figures standing in front of it: a tall man, a small girl with bright hair, and a 4th figure, which had been carefully erased with a thick pencil. "What are you doing, honey?" he asked, trying to sound normal, although his heart ached at the sight of the drawing. "I'm drawing our new home," she replied, not lifting her head. "The one where we'll live when you find a new job." "And who was that?" he asked gently, pointing to the erased spot. Susan looked at him with big, sad eyes that seemed too serious for an 8-year-old. "That was Miss Mary, but Daddy said we won't see her anymore, so I erased her." Robert felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. He sat next to his daughter and took her onto his lap. "Sweetheart, Daddy, why can't we see her anymore?" she asked, clinging to him. "Was she bad? Did she do something wrong?" "No, honey, she wasn't bad. Miss Mary is a very good person." "Then why can't we see her anymore? Is it because you're a maintenance man and she's an important lady in a fancy office?" The child's question was so direct and accurate that Robert didn't know how to answer, how to explain the intricacies of the adult world, the system of social divisions and economic pressures to an 8-year-old. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions," he said cautiously, "even when they don't want to." "But didn't you want to make that decision?" Susan was too smart for her age. Maybe that was the trait she inherited from her mother, a teacher who always knew how to get straight to the point. "No, sweetheart, I didn't want to." "Then why did you do it?" "Because I wanted to protect you." Susan pulled away from him and looked him straight in the eyes. "Daddy, I'm not scared. When Mum was sick, I wasn't scared either. I was sad, but I wasn't scared because I knew you were with me." Her words held a wisdom that most adults didn't possess. In her childlike logic, there was no room for social complexes or economic fears. "But Daddy," she continued, "maybe Miss Mary isn't scared either. Maybe she also wants to be with us even when it's hard." Robert couldn't answer. In the mouth of his child, his fear of survival in a merciless social system sounded like a justification for cowardice. At the same time, across town, Mary was not idle. She spent the last few days analyzing all the company documents she had access to, looking for anything that could help her in her fight against James, and she finally found what she was looking for. In the 2019 archive, among the documents concerning the bid for the factory construction in Pittsburgh, she discovered irregularities in the cost estimates. The amounts were systematically inflated by about 30%, and the difference was funneled to the accounts of consulting firms that, according to official registers, had no real headquarters. Upon further checking, it turned out that these companies belonged to Susan Jones, James's wife. This was evidence of corruption worth several $1 million. But as she was preparing the documentation, an envelope appeared on her desk with the results of Robert's background check that James had commissioned from the private detective. The information inside changed everything. Robert's real name was Robert Kramer. 7 years ago, he worked as the chief engineer at Industrial Builders in Washington, D.C. When the company began to fail due to the owner's dishonest financial dealings, most employees left, seeking safer places to work. Robert, however, remained in his position until the end, to ensure the completion of ongoing projects and protect his subordinates from unemployment. When Industrial Builders finally went bankrupt, it turned out that as chief engineer, he was legally responsible for the company's obligations to subcontractors. To protect his family from foreclosure and legal problems, he changed his last name and moved to Boston, giving up his engineering career. The truth was even more honorable than anything Mary had thought about him. Robert not only didn't use false qualifications, he had qualifications even higher than she had assumed, and he sacrificed his reputation and professional future to save others. For James, this was the perfect weapon. Robert was technically working under a false name, which constituted fraud against the employer. Mary put the document on the desk and for a long moment couldn't breathe normally. Robert was not only not a fraud, he was a hero, a man who sacrificed his own career and reputation to protect other people, and now James wanted to use that honor against him. That day, for the first time in weeks, she went out for lunch. She needed fresh air and time to think through her strategy. Boston in November was gloomy. Low clouds hung over the roofs of the brownstones, and the wind carried the promise of the first real snow of winter. It was no accident that her steps led her toward the diner where she had first met Robert privately. She hoped to find him there, but the diner was almost empty, just a few tourists with guidebooks and an elderly couple sipping sweet tea by the window. She sat down at their usual table and ordered a coffee that was bitter and almost cold, but it wasn't about the coffee. She needed a place where she could think calmly and plan her next moves. James had strong cards, compromising photos and the technical basis to accuse Robert of fraud, but she also had something, evidence of corruption worth millions of dollars. The question was, would it be enough for a defense? After an hour of fruitless contemplation, she decided to act. She returned to the office and called Robert on his mobile phone. "Mary?" His voice sounded surprised and uncertain. "We need to meet. It's urgent." "I thought we agreed." "Robert, I know the truth about Industrial Builders, about why you really changed your name." A long silence followed on the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about." "About your name being Robert Kramer, about how you stayed at the bankrupt company to protect your employees, about how you sacrificed your own future for others." Another silence. "Where are we meeting?" he finally asked. "The Anchor Diner. In an hour." When they met, Robert looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were circled, his face drawn with fatigue and stress. "How did you find out?" he asked, sitting across from her. "James ordered a check of your past, but he found something completely different than he expected." Mary told him everything, about the detective's report, the true story of Industrial Builders, the honor of his actions in changing his name. "That doesn't change the fact that I'm using a false name," Robert said. "In the eyes of the law, it's still fraud." "But it changes the perception of your motives," she replied, "and it gives me a weapon against James." She told him about the discovery of corruption, the consulting firms belonging to the CFO's wife, the millions of dollars defrauded from the company's budget. "Does that mean we can fight?" Hope sounded in his voice for the first time in days. "It means we have to fight," she corrected him, "but not alone." "What do you mean?" Mary leaned across the table. "We have evidence of James's crime, but to use it effectively, I need the support of someone who has real authority in the company." "CEO Johnson?" "Yes, but to convince him, I have to give him the full truth. About us, about you, about the whole situation." Robert went pale. "Mary, If you tell him about my real name, it might turn out to be our asset instead of a weakness, she interrupted. Robert, CEO David Johnson is a man who went from a shipyard worker to the owner of a company worth tens of millions. He understands what it means to fight for survival and sacrifice for others. What if he doesn't? Then we lose. But if we don't try, we lose for sure. Robert thought for a long time, staring into his steaming coffee. What about Susan? What will happen to her if everything goes wrong? Susan will have a father who didn't give up without a fight, Mary replied, and who showed her that sometimes you have to stand up for the truth, even when it's dangerous. Sounds familiar, Robert smiled sadly. She told me similar words yesterday. Smart girl. Like her mother, he nodded. All right, we'll try. But promise me one thing. What? If this doesn't work, you'll let me leave Boston and start a new life without looking back. Mary touched his hand. I promise, but on one condition. What? That you promise me that if it does work, you'll stop hiding behind the maintenance uniform and allow yourself to be who you truly are. They looked into each other's eyes, and both knew this might be their last chance at happiness. The next day, Mary scheduled a meeting with CEO David Johnson. His office on the 10th floor was a sanctuary of American business, walls covered with photos from important events in the country's history, shelves full of books on economics and management, and a place of honor for a photograph from a labor union march in 1980. CEO Johnson, despite his 63 years, was still an imposing figure, tall, with gray hair and penetrating eyes that could see right through people. Mary, James told me about the situation, the CEO began without preamble. Apparently you have some personal problems that might be affecting your work. Mary took a deep breath. Mr. Johnson, what I'm about to tell you may sound unbelievable, but please hear me out completely. And she told him everything. About Robert, about his true identity, about the honorable reasons for changing his name, about their relationship, about how she met the man hiding behind the maintenance uniform, and finally, about James's corruption and how the CFO was trying to use their relationship to get rid of her from the company. The CEO listened in silence, occasionally taking notes on a piece of paper. Do you have proof of what you're saying? He asked when she finished. Mary placed the folder on the desk with documents concerning the bids, the invoices from the consulting firms, and the activities of James's wife. David Johnson looked through the materials for 20 minutes, his face remaining unreadable. And this man, Kramer, would he agree to talk to me? Yes, sir. He's ready to face all the consequences. The CEO put down the documents and walked to the window overlooking downtown. Mary, do you know why I named my company Liberty Tech? Because you were involved in the civil rights movement. Not just that, he turned back to her. Because I believe that true strength lies in human solidarity, in the readiness to help others, even when it involves personal risk. He returned to his desk and sat down. This Kramer, he sacrificed his career to help colleagues. Yes. And you're risking your position in the company to protect him. Yes. The CEO nodded. Set up a meeting with him for tomorrow. I want to personally meet the man who knew how to do what he thought was right, without counting on benefits. That evening, Mary called Robert with the news that could change their lives. The CEO wants to meet you, she said. And what will you tell him? The truth, the whole truth. I'm ready, he replied, although the tension was audible in his voice. Robert, yes? Tomorrow could be the first day of our new future, or the last day of our dreams. Then let's make it one worth remembering. Chapter 6. The next day, at 9 in the morning, Robert stood in front of the main entrance of the Liberty Tech office building. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't use the service entrance from the courtyard. He wore the only suit he owned, a dark navy one that he had bought for his wedding to Jennifer 10 years ago and had been hanging unused in the closet since her death. Mary was waiting for him in the lobby. When she saw him, she momentarily held her breath. This elegantly dressed man did not resemble the maintenance man she had passed in the hallways for years. He was like a prince who had regained his true appearance. Ready? She asked, adjusting his tie in a gesture full of tenderness. No, he answered honestly, but I guess it doesn't matter. It does. It means you're doing it, despite the fear. They took the elevator to the 10th floor, where CEO David Johnson was waiting for them in his spacious office. The room was even more impressive than Robert remembered from the rare occasions he cleaned it. Mahogany furniture, walls covered with diplomas and awards, large windows with a view of the entire city. Please sit down. The CEO motioned to the leather armchair across from his desk. His tone was official, but Robert also detected curiosity in it. Mr. Kramer, the CEO began, tell me your story, the whole story, and Robert told him. About his studies at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he graduated as an engineer with honors, about his first bridge and industrial system designs, about his work at the steel mill, where his solutions were implemented throughout the entire country, about industrial builders, where he became the youngest chief engineer in history. He talked about the company's bankruptcy, how his boss had funneled the money abroad, leaving employees without pay and the company without funds to complete projects, about his decision to stay until the end to finish the construction work and protect his colleagues from accusations of legal negligence. "Why didn't you leave like the others?" the CEO asked. "Because there were 200 people with families working on the construction sites. Because there were projects that, if unfinished, could threaten the lives of users. Because—" he hesitated. "Yes. Because my wife taught me that sometimes you have to do what's right, even when it's hard." The CEO nodded. "And then?" Robert talked about the legal problems, about how as chief engineer he became responsible for the obligations of the bankrupt company, about the decision to change his name to protect his wife and daughter from eviction and foreclosure. "I moved to Boston where no one knew me. I hoped to find work in my profession under a new name, but," he shrugged, "the engineering industry requires references, recommendations, confirmation of skills. Without that, with a gap in my resume, I became invisible to employers. And then you took a job as a maintenance man? Jennifer got sick 6 months after we moved. I needed a steady job that would allow me to be with her every evening. The job at Liberty Tech gave me what I needed, financial stability and time flexibility. And why did you help the company without expecting anything in return?" Robert shrugged, the same gesture Mary had come to recognize as his trademark. "Because I saw a mistake that could cost you millions of dollars and threaten people's safety. I couldn't just walk by." The CEO stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk. "Mr. Kramer, I checked your professional history. I spoke with people who knew your work. Everyone talks about you as the most talented engineer of your generation." Robert was silent, not knowing how to answer. "I also checked the bridge project over the Hudson River that you designed. That bridge saved dozens of lives during the 1997 flood. Its structure withstood the pressure of water that destroyed 3 other crossings in the region." Mary looked at Robert, surprised. He had never told her about that project. "That was a team effort," Robert began. "I spoke with the manager of that project," the CEO interrupted. "He told me that you insisted on strengthening the foundations despite protests about the cost, that your calculations saved the bridge from destruction." The CEO returned to his desk and sat down. "Mr. Kramer, I have a proposal for you. But first, you need to know the truth about James Jones." And he told them about the investigation his company had been conducting for several months regarding irregularities in the bids, about the consulting firms belonging to the CFO's wife, the millions of dollars defrauded from the company's budget, the plans to refer the matter to the prosecutor's office. "James will be fired today," he concluded, "and he'll probably be in jail within a few months." Robert and Mary exchanged looks of relief and disbelief. "And now my proposal," the CEO continued. "I offer you the position of chief designer with full professional rehabilitation, a starting salary of $250,000 a year, your own team, and a voice in the company's strategic decisions. In return, I want your expertise, your honesty, and what I would call your solidarity with the company's mission." Then he looked at Mary. "And to you, daughter, I offer the position of Chief Executive Officer starting next January. You will be the youngest CEO in the history of the American technology sector." They both sat in a daze, unable to believe what they were hearing. "But there's one condition," the CEO added with a twinkle in his eye. "What?" they asked simultaneously. "That you finally stop hiding your relationship. The company needs transparency, and I'm tired of rumors and speculation." Mary burst out laughing, the first honest, joyful laugh she had uttered in weeks. "Does that mean—" Robert began. "It means that true love and honest action pay off," the CEO replied. "Sometimes you just have to wait for the right moment and the right people." 2 hours later, they were sitting at a table in the diner downtown, the same one where they had first talked as equals, not as vice president and maintenance man. This time, however, they weren't hiding in a corner, but sat at the central table, holding hands and planning their future. "I can't believe this happened," Mary said, sipping the bourbon they had ordered in honor of the new life. "Me neither," Robert replied. "But the most important question is, what will I tell Susan? She'll want to know everything." "We'll tell her the truth," Mary corrected him, "that sometimes life gives a second chance to people who don't give up and fight for what they believe in." "We'll tell her," Robert repeated. "Does that mean—" "It means that if you want me to, I'd like to be a part of your family," she said, blushing slightly. "I don't know how to be a mom to an 8-year-old, but I'd like to learn." Robert stood up from his chair, walked to her side of the table and knelt on one knee. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. "Mary Brown," he said loudly, ignoring the tourists staring at them. "Will you be my wife and stepmother to Susan, who already loves you before she even knows you well?" A complete silence fell in the diner. Everyone was looking at them, the waiters, the guests, the passers-by outside the window. "Yes!" Mary cried out, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, yes!" The entire diner erupted in applause. The older waiter brought them a bottle of bourbon from the management, and a young couple of tourists were taking their pictures, visibly moved by the romantic scene. When the emotions subsided and the fervor of the celebration passed, they sat close together, planning the practical aspects of their new life. "We'll have to find a bigger apartment," Mary said. "Something where Susan has her own room, an office for you, and a place where we can all be together. And where you can work when you need quiet," Robert added. "CEO is a great man, but companies demand dedication. How about a house?" she suggested. "With a garden for Susan, a workshop for you, and an office for me." "A house," Robert repeated dreamily. "Since Jennifer's death, I haven't even dared to think about a house. And now? Now I'm thinking about a house where we'll all be together. Where Susan can invite her friends for birthdays, where we can host Christmas Eve dinners, where—" He paused. "Where what? Where we'll be happy," he simply finished. 3 months later, a double ceremony took place. Robert officially changed his name back to Kramer and was reinstated as an engineer with all honors. Mary officially took the position of Chief Executive Officer of Liberty Tech, becoming an icon of young, dynamic American business. But much more important than the official ceremonies was the personal ceremony, the wedding that took place at the Cathedral of St. Joseph downtown in the presence of their closest friends, colleagues, and, above all, Susan, in a white dress, as their main witness. The 8-year-old girl prepared a special drawing for the occasion, a house with a red roof, a garden full of flowers, and 3 figures in front of it, a tall man, an elegant woman, and a small girl. This time, none of the figures was erased. "This is our new home," she said, handing the drawing to the newlyweds, "the place where we'll all be happy." And indeed, a year later, they lived in such a house, a 2-story building on the outskirts of Boston, with a view of the city. Robert had his workshop where he designed systems for the largest companies in the Rust Belt. Mary had an office from which she managed the company that had become one of the most respected in the country. Susan had a garden where she grew flowers, and a room full of books where she was preparing to become an engineer, like Daddy. But the most important thing was that they had each other. Every evening when everyone came home, they sat together at dinner, telling each other about their day. Robert talked about projects that saved cities from ecological disasters. Mary shared the successes of the company that, under her leadership, was gaining increasing recognition on the international stage. Susan talked about school, friends, and the book she was reading, and when it was time for breakfast, each of them knew they had a place where they were loved, respected, and needed. The story of Robert and Mary became legendary among Liberty Tech employees, passed down from generation to generation as proof that miracle-like transformations are possible, but only for those who have the courage to fight for their beliefs and don't let social divisions and economic pressure destroy their dreams. On the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, during the company Christmas Eve dinner in the Liberty Tech lobby, CEO David Johnson raised a glass to the CEO and the chief designer, to the people who proved that in our country, talent and an honest heart are more important than social origin, to the love that proves stronger than all adversities, and to the company where every person, whether cleaner or CEO, can realize their dreams if only they have enough determination. And everyone present, from the cleaning staff to the board members, knew that the toast was true. At Liberty Tech, indeed, every talented and honest person had a chance, regardless of what uniform they wore to work on their first day. That evening, when everyone had gone home, Robert and Mary were left alone in the office building. They stood by the window on the 10th floor, looking at the snowy Boston skyline, at the lights flickering in the windows of thousands of families who, just like them, were building their happiness day by day. "Did you expect this when you first corrected those calculations on the board?" Mary asked, cuddling into his arm. "I expected to be fired," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I didn't expect a whole life, and I expected another boring day at the office," she said. "I didn't expect to meet the man who would teach me what true love means." When they walked out of the building, this time together through the main entrance as equals, the snow was falling more heavily, covering the street with a white blanket that made Boston look like a fairy tale. And maybe that was their story, like a fairy tale in which good triumphs over evil, love conquers all adversities, and dreams come true for those who have the courage to fight for them until the end. The end. If you were Robert who lost everything but didn't lose his honor, would you have the courage to put love above social conventions and fight for true love despite the whole world being against you? Write in the comments where you're watching this story from, and if you believe that love can change everything, even the hardest reality.